Hey there folks, and welcome to another dive down the MIDI rabbit hole. Today we're looking at MIDI and audio routing in your DAW and how I combine all my hardware and software synthesizers into one seamless environment. We'll be looking at all the routing, including audio tracks, MIDI tracks, instrument tracks for VST software synths, templates, and how I physically control everything. My previous videos on MIDI have received over 160,000 views, helping many people, so stick around and hopefully you'll find this one useful too. If you have any questions, please post them in the comments and I'll see if I can help. I'll be showing you my current setup with a 16-channel audio interface and then my old setup, which was a mixer running into a 4-channel audio interface. I'll be using Cubase Pro here, but everything I'm doing is also possible in lower versions such as Artist or Elements. Your DAW of choice may be different, but the principles are pretty much the same. First then, the 16-channel interface setup. All my hardware synths and MIDI controllers connect to the computer via USB. I actually use a couple of powered USB hubs. In addition, they're all connected by MIDI cables to enable everything when the computer is off, but I've not shown these here as today we're just talking about the DAW connections and routing. The audio outputs from the hardware synths, vocal effect unit and electric guitar all plug into the audio interface. The audio interface connects directly to the computer via USB. It's always preferable for this to be a direct connection and not through a USB hub. The audio inputs from the interface are routed to audio tracks in the DAW, with a separate audio track for each synth, the drum machine, the vocals and the guitar. The hardware synths are also routed to dedicated MIDI tracks, so I can record the MIDI data and record it to the audio tracks when I'm ready, or indeed record the audio and MIDI at the same time. Then I have my drums with a MIDI track for the physical TR-8S drum machine and 3 separate instrument tracks for my 3 drum VSTs. And finally, I have dedicated instrument tracks for VSTs grouped by manufacturer. But what if I didn't have a 16-channel audio interface? Well, in fact, I never used to, and used to have a mixer running into a 4-channel audio interface, and my setup used to look like this. The key differences here are that all the audio from the hardware connected to the mixer first, and then the main stereo output of the mixer went into 2 inputs on the audio interface. My microphone and guitar went into the other 2 inputs. This meant that my DAW could only receive the one audio track from the mixer containing the entire stereo mix of everything attached to it. I couldn't get separate audio tracks for each individual instrument simultaneously. If I wanted them separate, I'd have to record them individually. I could still, however, have separate audio tracks for the vocals and guitar. The MIDI tracks and VST instrument tracks operated exactly the same, except when I wanted to bounce my MIDI tracks to audio, I had to do them one at a time in real time, whereas now I can bounce them all to audio at the same time and to separate tracks, or indeed I can record the audio live from all synths to separate tracks simultaneously. To enable all this, I've set up a template in Cubase allowing me to control everything the same as I do when the computer is turned off. Other DAWs also allow you to set up templates similar to this. The template contains everything I want to be able to control and record. You'll notice all the MIDI and instrument tracks are named channel 1, channel 2, etc. as I have them arranged by MIDI channel and I'm using all 16 channels. This allows me to swap between tracks by changing channels on my MIDI controllers, which I'll demonstrate a little later. What this template then gives me is a structure and a starting point I can customise as any project takes shape. The audio tracks are used for recording audio direct from the external hardware synths, and under the routing options for each track there will be an input and an output relating to the audio source and the destination. That's where the sound is coming from and where you want the sound to be sent to. MIDI tracks are used for recording the MIDI data from external hardware synths, for example the notes played. These tracks do not contain any audio. For MIDI tracks there will be a few extra routing options. The input is where the signal is coming from, the input channel is the channel that the instrument is set to, the output is where you want the signal to be sent, For example, which instrument do you want the DAW to trigger when playing back MIDI data? An output channel, which again will be the channel that the instrument is set to, normally the same as the input. And then there are two boxes that say off, which are used for program changes, and a box for mapping drums, but we shan't be going into those today. Then there are instrument tracks, which are combined audio and MIDI tracks used for VST software synths. And again, the routing options are slightly different. We start with the input source, which is whatever you'll be using to play the VST. Then the input channel, which is whatever channel you want the VST to be triggered on. Next though, instead of an output like on the MIDI tracks, this is where you can now choose or change the VST plugin that will be used on the instrument track. Next is the channel for the VST, which again will usually be the same as the input channel. And again, the program change and drum map boxes, but we won't cover those today. Finally, there is a main output box which should be set to stereo out, as unlike MIDI tracks, these instrument tracks also contain audio data along with the MIDI. It's worth noting that in Cubase there is a fourth track option as well, which is called external instrument tracks. This takes your external hardware and effectively treats it like a VST. So you get one instrument track with both the audio and the MIDI combined. I haven't included this today as A, it's only something that's available in Cubase Pro, and I'm aware that not everybody has the Pro version, and B, I don't use it. I just use separate MIDI tracks and audio tracks. Before moving on, in order to create a template in Cubase, just set up all your tracks and routing, and then go to File, then click on Save as Template, and in the pop-up box, enter a name under where it says New Preset, and then click on OK. When you open a new project in Cubase, you'll see all your templates in the hub underneath the More tab. Again, other DAWs will have similar functionality. Now, let's look in detail at the routing for each track that enables all of this to work. First are the audio tracks. As mentioned earlier, I have a separate audio track for each individual hardware synth, the drum machine, vocal effects unit and guitar. All the audio tracks have their inputs set to the corresponding input on the audio interface and their output set to stereo out. For example, taking the Rode wireless mic, the input is set to Rode Go and the output to stereo out. And if I go to my audio connections, you can see that the Rode Go input is actually input 1 on my audio interface, which the mic is attached to. And then if I go to say my Polybrute, the input is now different. And again, if we then look at the audio connections, you can see that the Polybrute input actually relates to inputs 7 and 8 on the audio interface. As earlier, if I was using a mixer with just one stereo output running into the interface, I would just get one stereo track for all my synths. In that case, I would just set up one audio track in the DAW with the input as the main stereo in and the output as the stereo out. If you do want the ability though to record everything to separate audio tracks simultaneously, then a multi-channel interface is the way to go, and you'll need as many inputs as you have sound sources. And there are solutions to achieve this, such as a digital mixer with an audio interface built in, such as the Tascam Model 24 or the Zoom Live Track L20. They do smaller versions depending on how many inputs you need. These mixers also act as audio interfaces over USB and can send each input as a separate audio track to your DAW. However, they tend to be fairly pricey, starting at approximately £500 for the smaller ones and going up to over £1,000. The other option is to use an audio interface with enough inputs for all your gear. For instance, I need 14 inputs, which would need to be sent to the DAW as 9 separate tracks, 5 stereo and 4 mono tracks. My solution was the Audient Evo 16 and SP8, giving 16 channels for input and plenty of outputs, which is around £750, so again, fairly pricey. There are more budget-friendly solutions, and in reality just as good, such as the Behringer 1820 that has 8 inputs, extended with an ADAT box like the Behringer ADA 8200, which would give the same 16 inputs and therefore up to 16 audio tracks in your DAW. So that's the main audio sources, but what about recording MIDI from your hardware synths? Let's take my MODX8 Plus first, as that's on MIDI channel 1 and a good place to start. Here the input is all MIDI inputs and the input channel set as 1, same as the MODX itself. The output is set as the MODX and again is on channel 1. The reason for using all MIDI inputs and not just the MODX is because I want to be able to control and record the MIDI from the MODX via various different controllers. If I go to Studio Setup and the MIDI port setup in Cubase, you'll see that I have the MODX along with the Matrix Brute and the Poly Brute, the Deep Mind and the TR8S selected under In All MIDI Inputs, along with my MIDI keyboards like the Keylab 61, the KeyStep Pro and the KeyStep 37. This enables me to record the MIDI data either by playing each of the synths themselves or triggering them with the MIDI keyboards. The same approach then applies to all the other hardware, with the MIDI channel inputs and outputs set to match the actual channel that the hardware synth is set to. An important note here, depending on your setup, you may or may not run into problems such as MIDI loops. For some hardware, when the MIDI channels for the inputs and outputs are set the same, you may get an echo, or what you might call a slight chorusing effect while playing. This is because of the MIDI looping back out of the DAW and into your synth while you're playing, effectively triggering the sound twice, once when you hit the key on the keyboard and again when it receives the signal back from the DAW. To cure this, you can usually either turn local control off on the respective keyboard or turn off the MIDI through function in Cubase. The only issue with turning off the MIDI through in Cubase is that you'll no longer be able to play your VSTs. I've actually set up a keyboard shortcut to toggle the MIDI through on and off, which when I press gives a handy message so I know which state it's in. So here I have a message saying that the MIDI through is deactivated, and if I press it again I get a message saying activated, deactivated, activated. I have the MIDI through off when playing and recording hardware synths and on for VSTs. When playing back the MIDI you've recorded, it doesn't matter whether the through is on or off. That's all the hardware synths taken care of and MIDI channels 1 to 6 swallowed up, so now let's move on to the drums. Here I have 3 instrument tracks for my drum VSTs and a MIDI track for the physical TR8S drum machine. Looking at my Spark Drums VST, I have the inputs again set as all MIDI inputs, so I can control the VST from whatever synth or controller I want, and I have the input set to MIDI channel 7, as that's the channel I want to trigger it on. I then have Spark chosen as the plugin from the drop-down menu. Next, there is an extra output box that you will only see for multi-timbral VSTs, which is a whole topic for another video. But here, this output is the same channel as the input. And then finally, the main channel output is set to channel 1. This may seem odd, but I found it has to be this way for it all to work with multi-timbral VSTs. The main output is then set to stereo out. The other 2 drum VSTs are then set up on channels 8 and 9, and the TR8S is set to MIDI channel 10. I then have instrument tracks set up for all my remaining VSTs. For organisation purposes, I've set up 1 track for each manufacturer, and for each of these I can choose which plugin from that maker I want to use. If I want to use different plugins from the same maker, I can then just duplicate the track and insert a new plugin. As I mentioned earlier, this is about having a basic template that I can then customise as needed when working on a project. Taking the first one as an example, we have Arturia. This is set to all MIDI inputs and the input channel set as 11, as again, that's the channel I want to trigger it on. Next is my chosen plugin, Pigments in this case. And if I click on the drop down, I can swap it for another plugin. The instrument channel is then set to the same as the input, 11 in this case, and the main output is then set to stereo out. This is the same for all the VST tracks, with them being assigned to the remaining channels 12 to 16, with 2 exceptions. For Omnisphere, as it is a multi-timbral VST, it's like the Spark Drum VST we mentioned earlier, with the first output set to 12, matching the input, and the main output set to channel 1. The other exception is my Equator 2 software linked to my Roly C-board. Here the input is set to the C-board Rise 49 and not all MIDI inputs, as that is the only thing I want to use to control the Equator software. The input channel and the output channel are both then set to any. This is because Equator and the Roly C-board are MPE or MIDI polyphonic expression capable and use all 16 channels simultaneously for input and output. Last but not least, I've then colour coded my tracks. This may seem a bit unnecessary or just for aesthetics, but bear with me, there is very good reason. First, it allows me at a glance to know what sort of track I'm using. So if I look at the mixer at the bottom, red is for audio tracks, orange for MIDI tracks of hardware synths, yellow for drums, and green for VSTs. Second, I use the Avid Control app on my iPad to remotely control Cubase. And if I go to the Tracks option in the Avid Control app, I can separate the tracks by colour. Here you can see a mirror image of my iPad, and you can see that I've got all the red tracks, which is the audio along the top, then the orange tracks, which is MIDI, the yellow tracks that are the drums, and the green tracks, which are my VSTs. There are 2 other tracks in blue, but don't worry about those, they're just to do with my personal setup. From here, I can, for example, quickly and easily press the record button and then choose tracks, and you'll see the record lights coming on. And I can do the same for things like mute and solo. If you want to know more about the Avid Control app, I've done a separate video on that, and I'll leave a link down below. And that is how I have everything set up, combining all my hardware and software into one seamless hybrid environment. To finish, here's a short demonstration showing how I can control this all. Here I have my KeyStep 37 sitting on the desk in front of my computer with Cubase fired up, and by moving through each of the 16 MIDI channels on the KeyStep 37, I can play any one of my hardware synths or the instrument tracks for my VST synths, like this. On channel 1, I've got the MODX8 Plus. On channel 2, I've got the Matrix Brute. On channel 3, I've got the Deep Mind. On channel 4, I've got the Poly Brute. On channel 5, I've got the Pro 1. On channel 6, I've got the Neutron. On channel 7, I've got my Spark drums. On channel 8, I've got Stylus RMX drums. On channel 9, I've got my 80s Max drums. On channel 10, I've got my TR8S drum machine. On channel 11, I've got Arturia's Pigments. On channel 12, I've got Spectrasonic's Omnisphere. On channel 13, I've got my Korg Poly 6. On channel 14, I've got the Roland System 1. On channel 15, I've got Steinberg Retrolog. And on channel 16, I've got Arturia's Analog Lab. And as well as being able to control everything with my KeyStep 37, I can also do exactly the same with my KeyStep Pro and my Keylab 61, setting them to whatever MIDI channel I want to trigger whatever hardware synth or software VST synth I want. And of course, I can also play each of the individual hardware synths using their own keyboards themselves. And whichever way I choose to play, I can record the MIDI data and the audio into Cubase on my computer. So that really is everything. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you have, please don't forget to like, subscribe and ring that bell, as it really does help in supporting me to create more content like this for you. Also, if you have any questions, please post them in the comments and I will get back to you to see if I can help. Indeed, any comments or feedback are of course highly appreciated. But for now, I've been Graham, take care and catch you later.